But we have to start with a note of caution, because I'm afraid we've all been subjected to a barrage of propaganda that is nearly 2,000 years old, and it's had a very strong effect on us, and it determines the way we look at Roman military equipment, unlike many other things in the Roman world. And that is Trajan's column, which you can see on the left-hand side of your screen. A marble column erected in the Forum of Trajan. You can see Trajan himself next to it, as he is depicted on the helical frieze, talking to his troops, and he's got his staff of authority, his imperium there. And the influence of Trajan's column began very soon, because it was sort of badly photocopied by the Marcus column of Marcus Aurelius, commemorating his battles in north of the Danube against the Marcomannic tribes. Trajan's column, of course, commemorates his wars in Dacia, virtually modern Romania, both wars, although the inscription on the column makes no mention of them. It just discusses the fact that it marks the height to which or the depth to which the forum was excavated before it was erected, and it was designed to be the last resting place for Trajan's ashes. Sadly, they are no longer there. The column is best known perhaps for the helical frieze, which winds its way up the column in a cinematic fashion. You could find papers discussing the way the narrative unfolds, and is carved in great detail, far more detail than anybody who looked at it would be able to tell. There were balconies all around the Forum of Trajan, so you could look on, see the thing. But the fine details like the chiseling of the mail of soldiers. You can see some soldiers on the right-hand side from one of the plaster casts that were made, which is now in the Museo della Civiltà Romana in EUR, which is well worth a visit. And it has the advantage, as do all of the plaster casts, of preserving more detail than you can actually see on the column itself now, because sadly it's been eroded by pollution over the years, particularly from cars and from oil burning fires. But on the right you can see three principal types of troops. You can see a legionary soldier, or rather a citizen soldier, on the right hand side with his lorica segmentata and his rectangular curved shield. Next to him at the back there's a cavalryman wearing a mail shirt and clutching a horse, just to make the point, and then in front of him there's an auxiliary infantry. So the column used a shorthand to depict the different troop types all over the helical frieze. So you could pick out the citizen soldiers, because of course they were most important. The auxiliary soldiers were dispensable, shall we say. It's the citizens who matter. And at the base of the column, on the pedestal, there is a depiction of captured weaponry from the Dacians and their Sarmatian allies. And on the right-hand side, you can see another of the casts in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which, unlike the one in Rome, is not laid out on the floor for you to go and look at. This one is actually two half columns in the cast court at the V&A, and that too is well worth a view if you happen to be in London. And you can see here a trophy showing captured weaponry of the sort that ends up on that pedestal on four sides of the base of the column. Now it's done in incredibly high detail and arguably more accurate than the depiction on the helical frieze. But Trajan's column has dictated how we see Roman soldiers for a long time. So we know that legionaries all wear lorica segmentata, auxiliaries all wear mail, and so on and so forth. And this dictates our image of things to the point where reenactors originally, many years ago, looked like they'd been lifted off the face of Trajan's column. Nowadays, however, as with the Owen Street Guard on the left and the Turma performance in Carlisle on the right, archaeology has been used to leaven the effect of Trajan's column, so that instead of having loads of soldiers who all look identical, you'll find that there's some variety. There's brass helmets, there's steel helmets, and what have you. So not everybody looks like a member of the Borg about to attack the Federation. And we know Trajan's column is misleading because we have the metopes, the reliefs from the Tropium Traiani, the trophy of Trajan, set up at Adam Clissi in the Dobruja, Romania, next to the Danube, to commemorate the battles. But this is executed by military sculptors rather than by metropolitan artistic sculptors who had their own agenda when they were producing Trajan's column. This is by military sculptors, and it is far more accurate as far as we can tell in terms of the equipment. And you can see here legionary soldiers. The one on the left has thrown his rectangular curved shield to the ground, so we know he's a legionary, but he's wearing scale armor, and he's about to stick his sword in a Dacian who's running away. And on the right-hand side, there's a legionary, again with a rectangular shield, wearing mail, who's actually in the process of sticking his sword in one of the Dacians who's got his long curved falx, the wicked weapon that caused some consternation to the Romans. One of the details which you can't really see on these, but does show up elsewhere on the metopes, is the fact that the helmets of these troops are fitted with cross pieces to add to the protection, a feature that doesn't appear on Trajan's column, but which does appear on the Adam Clissi metopes, and which we know from archaeological finds was put into practice as a field modification to helmets. So the accuracy of these reliefs shows us what the Roman army actually looked like in the field, as opposed to Trajan's column, which is an idealized version. And there's a couple of legionaries, Caius Castricius from Budapest, and one of the Sertorius brothers from Verona on the right. Again, male on the left, scale on the right, they're legionaries. So not everybody was wearing aurica segmentata, and the chap on the left also has an oval shield. How dare he? So what can we say about the identity of the troops at Trimontium? We have a very rich resource in the material that comes particularly from the pits, and it is predominantly dating to the first Flavian occupations of the site, but there's also quite a reasonable amount of material from the Antonine occupation of the site. And fortunately, unlike most Roman sites where there's continuous occupation, it can be quite difficult to tell the two apart. It is quite easy to distinguish the material at Trimontium, both in terms of its date and to whom it belonged. So we'll start with one of the most prominent components of the Newstead collection, and that is the cavalry material. Now we know from the later occupation that we have both members of the 20th Legion and the Alava Contiorum based at Trimontium, but we don't know the identity of the units who were there in the earlier period, but the archaeological evidence tells us that yet again we're dealing with a mixture of cavalry and legionaries, and as such Newstead fits in rather nicely as larger than a standard fort. It's what I like to call a vexillation fort, so not up to the full size of a vexillation fortress, but a garrison post that used legionaries and cavalry. You have to think of cavalry in the Roman period as being a bit like air cover in the modern period. If you think of the Battle of the Ardennes, when the Germans invaded the Ardennes and the Allies were hampered by the fact they had no air cover because of bad weather, cavalry provided the air cover for the Roman legionaries. Without them, legionaries were very vulnerable to attack particularly by guerrilla warfare, by skirmishing light troops. Cavalry helped them protect them, and also provided the ability to mount long-ranging patrols. So this is a rather nice snaffle bit. There's another one, a similar design, that comes from one of the bits, and that is Flavian in date. Anne Hyland published an article on both the main types of bit from Newstead and commented on how severe they are if they're not used correctly. And we have quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the Romans went in for some severe bitting. This piece is particularly interesting. The little arch in the center at the top sticks into the roof of the mouth of the horse and gives control that way. And the reins are attached to the loops at the bottom, the loops at the top attaching to the headstall or bridle. And here's a rather nice relief of Flavius Bassus from Cologne in Germany. And you can see here he has just such a curved bit of the sort that was found at Newstead. Apart from actual bits, the Romans made use of headstalls that the terminology of which is controversial. They often get called hackamores, and then some horse people will say, no, they're not hackamores. So the general term that's used for them these days is a sullion, with a silent P at the beginning, which is a Greek designation. And these things, instead of controlling the mouth of the horse, control the external soft bits of the horse, so around the muzzle. And they provide an alternative means of control. You often find one or the other used, but the Romans went for both. So you can see that Bassus's horse not only has a curb bit, but he also has a sullion cum hackamore over the nose of the horse to keep it under control. The cavalryman had a task in hand because he not only had to hold the reins in his left hand, he had to hold the shield in his left hand and hold a weapon in his right. So it's a bit like rubbing your hat and patting your tummy to control one of these things. And these were spirited horses. They would join in with the fighting. They weren't shy. Amongst the other material, this is a rather nice little piece, which is a junction, which acted to join straps of the saddle harness. You can see two different types of slightly earlier junction. You can see the earliest form of all, which is a ring junction on the right-hand side within the box. And then on the rest of on the left-hand side, you can see a pelter, a phallera junction. And in the 1st century AD, these were joined through individual loops concealed behind the phallera, the disc. In the Antonine period, they reverted to using external rings, as you can see in this example from the collection. And this is interesting because this was a form of junction that was being used in the Augustan period, but which went out of favor. And the concealed rings started to be used from the time of Tiberius onwards. But it then gets reintroduced in the Antonine period. We have no idea what caused them to change again. It makes no material difference to the way that the system functioned. This is another nice little piece. This is an Antler Crown from Newstead, and you can see it has a phallus carved in the center of it. These things are, when the antler is shed, you chop the base of it off and you can then carve it. And they act as, we think, a good luck amulet. And let's go back to Bassus, because lo and behold, he's wearing one on the right-hand side, you can see, on the breast or the base of the neck of the horse. And those chain that it's attached to, we now know is made up of copper alloy beads and glass melon beads. We have examples that have actually been excavated and found in a cemetery at Crayfield Gallop, where there was a battle in AD 70. Some horses were buried with their equipment. When a horse is killed in battle in the Roman period, you don't pick it up and take it somewhere. You just dig a hole and push the horse in. It's the easiest way to do things. Most of the stuff is taken off them, but one or two things were missed, and some of these beads were found. So that gives us a little context to this rather nice little antler disc. One, or rather two, of the most important finds that came from Newstead, and the first of a number that have subsequently come to light, is the leather chamfron, or this leather chamfron. There's another one, decorated with brass beads and brass appliques in the form of leaves and figured heads and studs. And you can see its reconstruction on the right-hand side, show you the sort of thing that would be used. And the eyes would be filled with a mesh eye protector, similar to the ones you can see on these horses at during the Hadrian's Cavalry Terma performance. The horses have absolutely no objection to using these things. They adapt to them very quickly. It's the first thing you ask anybody who rides with them. Did they have any trouble with them? No, they have no trouble with them at all. Horses are very tolerant things. They don't mind having people dressed strangely sitting on top of them. More cavalry equipment. There's this couple of rather interesting fragments in the collection, which if you place them correctly, you realize you've got a rather splendid example, part of a splendid example, of the cheek piece of a cavalry battle helmet. Now in a minute we'll see the famous parade or sports helmets, but the Roman army actually went into battle with highly decorated battle helmets, which were operated in a different way. They were a helmet bowl with a neck guard and with cheek pieces. And this is one of those cheek pieces. It has an iron base and then has an embossed copper alloy sheeting over the top of it. And this one has some sort of god. You can just see his foot on the right-hand side resting on a flat base. And I'll show you an example of what this would have looked like. Here's a rather splendid example from Xanten on the Rhine on the left-hand side. This one was dredged up from gravel working, probably associated with the now lost later legionary fortress at Xanten, Xanten II, Vetera II. The first one was first founded in the Augustan period and then rebuilt numerous times and finally destroyed in the Civil War of 69-70. And they moved the site a little bit over towards the river, and subsequently changes the course of the Rhine have removed the site, but a large amount of military equipment has come from there, including this very fine helmet, which again has an iron base. So the bowl and the cheek pieces are made of iron, and then a copper alloy sheeting is applied over the top, and then there's gilding and tinning as well to add to the appearance. So extremely splendid, glittering appearance. And this is a genuine battle helmet rather than one of the sports helmets. And on the right, it's Flavius Bassus again. And you can see he's wearing one of these helmets with cheek pieces and with imitation hair, just like that on the battle helmet. The sports helmets, of course, are very well known, fine examples. There's not much more I can say about them apart from the fact that these are not intended for use in battle. Everything about them is designed to test the ability of the rider and provide spectacular display. The eye holes limit the vision of the user. His peripheral vision is severely hampered, so it's a very good reason why you wouldn't use these in battle. But what they do is they provide an extra element of test for the rider to be able to cope with the challenges that the Hippica Gymnasia provided to them. And you can see some of the riders from the Terma display showing you the sort of thing that you would see when these chaps were out there performing these evolutions. As I said, they were done as a display, but also as a form of training. So just as the Red Arrows are one of our, arguably our leading display aerial performers for the military, it also is an important element of training to be able to perform displays like this. Formation flying is important to the Air Force, and being able to ride particular evolutions is important to the cavalry in the Roman period. And there was a set of prescribed maneuvers that we know of, which were practice for battle, for the way that these cavalry were used. They were mainly used for skirmishing, for patrols, and for the role of light cavalry as opposed to sort of cavalry who'd charge at somebody and scare them. But only a few of the best riders had the face mask helmets, and as you can see, these rather nice yellow plumes. There is a lot of cavalry equipment. These are some more loops, junction loops. It's a very famous set from a very nice colour painting that's in the Curl volume. And these are very characteristic of 1st century AD military equipment, and unsurprisingly it comes from one of the Flavian pits. But this particular design you can find from the Claudian period onwards. So it's been around quite a while by the time it's deposited towards the end of the 1st century AD. Some more junction loops, and this is showing you how they function. You can see on the one hand, the ones with the particularly elaborately decorated loops belong with ring junctions. And as I said, ring junctions are the earlier form of junction in use in the Roman army. And the ones with the plain loops are from concealed junctions behind phalleri. The harness was fastened using a system of eyelets, and there would be a matching fitting with a T-bar in it, which would fit through and twist, keeping the whole thing secure in use. So there we are, showing you what the reconstruction would look like. And then it was decorated with a whole series of mounts, which arguably aren't functional, but they do add to the bling factor and the whole way of overwhelming your enemy with the magnificence of your appearance, particularly since they were used in matching sets. They would be frequently silvered, tinned or silvered, with a thin silver foil applied using solder, and with yellow inlay decoration set into the surface. So a contrast between the black of the yellow, dark blue of the yellow, and the white of the silver. And there were various straps that hung down and would swing around as the horse moved. So you've got a whole dynamic sort of appearance, and these are strap terminals. Again, they don't do anything apart from add a little extra in terms of the appearance. The one on the bottom left in particular is rather interesting because it's quite an early example. You find those in the Tiberian or Claudian period. So some of the equipment is quite dated by the time it goes into the ground, into the pits in particular. Rather splendid set on the left-hand side, showing you some of this silvering with, you can see the marks where the yellow was situated. There's two particularly good finds of this material, one from Doorwerth in the Rhine in the Netherlands, and another from Xanten, which is now in the British Museum, which you can see in their Roman and Greek gallery. Some more pendants in the bottom right, and then you can see my reconstruction of what a horse in its long reigning form would look like, with the straps, the pendant straps, the phalleri, the pendants, showing you all the different elements that went to make these horses. And this is drawn from some of the tombstones of cavalrymen, which show us particularly how they decorated the animal and how they used them. There are two of these saddle plates, again decorated. They're made of copper alloy, usually brass. Brass was the favoured copper alloy in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and on into the 3rd century for the military, as opposed to gunmetal bronze, which was used for things like brooches and so forth. The army liked to work with brass, and you can see these saddle plates. They're purely decorative. They do nothing in terms of the use or the battle worthiness of the horse. They are purely decorative, and you can see them in use on this sculpture, a so-called Totenmal tombstone. At the top you have the soldier having his final heavenly meal. At the bottom you can see him or his servant putting the horse through its paces. You see he's got the horse on a long rein, standing close behind it, controlling the horse and giving a display. And if you've ever seen the Lipizzana horses from the Spanish riding school in Vienna, they do a similar display with long reins. You can get the horse to rear up and do all sorts of fancy stuff. It's again another form of training, but it's also a way of giving a very spectacular display. And here's somebody recreating this. This was at St Andrews in 2016 when we had a conference before the Hadrian's cavalry tournament performance. And you can see how he's controlling the horse in much the same way. And I asked him, how confident do you feel standing that close behind the horse? And he said, you have to know the horse quite well. Otherwise it will let you know in no uncertain terms that it's not impressed. The saddle, the Roman saddle, was particularly interesting, often called the Celto-Roman saddle, because we know that it was in use before the Romans. It's found on a number of monuments as captured material. It's shown on the Gunderstrup cauldron, probably from the steppe region in origin, but certainly developed by the people who get called Celts as shorthand, the Gallic people, whatever you want to call them. And it's got we think it's got a wooden frame with metal plates over the wooden plane, and then the leather cover over that. And part of one of these leather covers you can see on the left-hand side, you can see part of the saddle horn, which is indicated on the right. And then you can see those little curvy eyelet things. That's where the straps hang down, the triplet straps, which we think are the way it's secured to the wooden tree underneath that's the frame of the saddle. So that's the cavalry. We know there's cavalry at Newstead, lots of it, because the material is there in the ground. Now we come on to the legionaries. We have no evidence that auxiliary troops used Lorica segmentata. To some extent, Trajan's column was right in using it as a shorthand for citizen soldiers. It's often been suggested that Lorica segmentata finds from sites, particularly smaller sites, is evidence that auxiliary soldiers used it. But it's a sort of a flipped logic, because most of these sites don't have the evidence to back up the support that it's auxiliary troops using it. So everything we have says that, so far as we can tell, the legionary troops were the only ones who fought with Lorica segmentata, but they also used mail and scale. They were the only troops who used all three types of armor. Auxiliaries stuck with scale and mail. And you can see surrounding this piece, this reconstructed cuirass, various bits and bobs that have come from this Corbridge type Lorica segmentata. No surprises there. It's very prone to failure of these component parts. They are riveted to the steel plates with copper alloy rivets, usually very high copper content rivets. And these wear loose in battle. If you talk to reenactors, most of them carry spare bits of leather lacing so they can tie themselves together if bits fall off during a reenactment, which does happen with regularity, all of which is indicative of the fact that this stuff sheds its components quite readily into the archaeological record, unlike things like mail, which doesn't. The point being that it's difficult to judge the relative use of the different forms of armor by the amount you find, because mail is very difficult to destroy. It sort of has its own contained integrity. It doesn't shed rings or anything unless it's been really thoroughly whacked by somebody. in the course of normal use, it will just maintain its integrity. Lorica segmentata, on the other hand, doesn't. It falls to pieces, and if you jump up and down, you're going to create a pile of rubble underneath you. One of the most interesting things to come out of Newstead, and this came from the well in the headquarters building, and this can be nicely dated to the Antonine period, is what's become known as the Newstead form of the Lorica segmentata, the development after the Corbridge form. We now know there's three principal forms. There's the Calcresa type that was found at that site, dating to the Augustan period. In the Claudian period, they move on to the Corbridge type, and then end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, this Newstead type begins to be used. And this is the form that goes on into the end of the 3rd century. Although it has to be said, they also kept some of the Corbridge pieces in service. It's a somewhat equivalent to not using Spitfires in the modern RAF, but using Sopwith camels. So stuff is, if it's serviceable, they used it basically. They weren't too fussy. Some other bits of helmet, which are rather nice because they show, again, different troop types. And these are, particularly the piece on the top right, from the Antonine period. This is one of the helmet cross pieces that, remember I talked about how the Dacian wars led to the Roman army reinforcing their helmets to help against blows to the helmet bowl. And this feature was retained after the Dacian wars, and helmets started using that. On the left-hand side at the top, you can see an ear guard. Early Roman helmets kept the ears within the helmet bowl, but in the 1st century AD, ears started sticking out. And so to protect them, they put little guards that flared out over the ears to stop having your ears chopped off. And at the bottom, there's a few small pieces of decorated cavalry helmet. And so again, you can see here on the bottom left, one of these ear guards on that helmet from Xanten. And on the right, you can see a reconstruction of the Niederbiber helmet, which also has ear guards and has some of these cross pieces over the top, again in brass. Brass continues to be used over a steel bowl with steel cheek pieces. And you can see how the helmet is enclosing the wearer. Cavalry helmets looked very different in the 2nd and 3rd century AD. This was long thought to be, Russell Robinson, who wrote a memorable book on Roman imperial armor, thought these were cavalry helmets, the ones on the right, but we now know that they're not, they're infantry helmets. So we know that we have infantry at Newstead, unsurprisingly, given the inscriptions of the 20th Legion, during the 2nd century AD. Also from the well in the Principia, which is a massive pit if you look at the cross section of the thing, along slightly above the Lorica segmentata came a set of brass scales, an alternative form of armor, as I've mentioned. These overlap like fish scales. They are wired to each other in each row, and then through the large hole in the center at the top, they are sewn to a fabric backing. So it gives you a degree of flexibility in movement. During the 2nd century AD, particularly about the time that Newstead is abandoned, a new type of scale is introduced where the scales are not only attached to each other side to side, but they're also attached to the scales below and above by wire twists, which type of armor, which I call semi-rigid, in that it lacks the flexibility of the this type of scale, but it has the added advantage that it's not quite so easy to slip a blade up between the scales as it is with this particular type of armor. So rather wise decision there. I talked about how rare mail is. There's some bits of mail. On the right hand side you can see 3 links. The link in the center has a little hole where the rivet went through. That one is made from steel wire that is drawn through a draw plate, then bent into a circle, the ends flattened, and then a rivet passed through it. Making mail is incredibly time consuming. I did some for some reenactors once, something I will never do again. It's also much heavier than Lorica segmentata. But as I said, it has the advantage of being having greater integrity, and to some extent, if you use it all the time, it's self-cleaning as well, because the action of the rings moving over each other keeps rust at bay. Should you find rusty mail, you can clean it up fairly quickly by sticking it in a barrel of sand and rolling it along if you feel the need. But its integrity is considerable unless you start hacking at it with some vengeance. On the left-hand side is a rather interesting piece of armor because the mail is made of copper alloy wire and it has small scales attached to it. It used to be thought this was a type of armor that we know from the sources of Lorica plumata, or feathery armor, but it's now, that interpretation has been dismissed. So it's now called mail and scale armor, but it's incredibly fine, much smaller rings than standard steel armor. A steel ring on a mail suit is around about 7 millimeters in diameter, with with wire about 1 millimeter in thickness, and this is much smaller, nearly half that. So in the ancient world, if it takes longer, it costs more. Most of the equipment the army used, they would have made themselves, but there was nevertheless a market for private production of equipment for people who had the money. One of the revolutions of the Roman army, one of the reasons that it became so successful, was that it took the armor of elites that it had fought against, so particularly the Gallic, the Celtic tribes, where the nobles would wear mail, but everybody else went into battle naked, and it enabled all of its troops to have armor through the simple means of inventing hire purchase. So when you joined the army, you bought everything you needed from them on tick at a nominal price. It wasn't a realistic price, and you then paid them back every time you got a payday. So you got this 3 or 4 times a year, you got this big chunk of money, and like everybody getting paid, as soon as it comes in, it then goes out, and you have to pay a vast amount to the army for what you'd had. I mean, if you're a cavalryman, not only did you have to pay them back for all your arms and armor, you also had to pay them for the fodder for your horse as well as have to pay for the horse. 125 denarii for a horse, cheap at half the price. So this element means that soldiers were enabled to have equipment by this process of hire purchase, effectively. If we look at the weaponry of the troops, these things long puzzled archaeologists. They weren't sure what they were. It was suggested that they might be practice ballista bolts because they have sort of blunt fungiform heads. Although, to be honest with you, I wouldn't want to be shot with a ballista with one of these any more than I would with one with a sharp point. In the end product is going to be the same. It's just the wound, the nature of the trauma is going to be slightly different. But fortunately, we now have evidence of what they actually are from Demeern, near Utrecht in the Netherlands. And you can see this javelin, which has a very fine inscribed head. Remember the shape, because we'll talk about the shape of the head in a while. The wood of the shaft and the ferrule that sits at the end of the shaft. One of the functions of these is so you can stick it in the ground, so you don't stand holding it all the time, but it also provides a counterbalance to the head when you're throwing it, because with javelins, of course, the most important thing is to be able to throw it. And as we know from Arrian's account of the Hippica Gymnasia and also Hadrian's review of the troops at Lambysis, they were obsessed with throwing javelins and the way you threw the javelin and how it passed through the air and wobbled and twisted and all the sort of things that pleased them. They were incredibly nerdy about throwing javelins. Pliny the Elder, the great encyclopedist, according to Tacitus, or according to Pliny the Younger, when he was commanding cavalry here on the Rhineland, wrote a treatise on the throwing of javelins from on horseback. I bet it was a fascinating read. Other interesting material that has come to light. This is an example of an arm guard, an articulated arm guard. Since the Newstead one was found, a number of other examples, including a complete one from, still unpublished unfortunately, from Salonița Gătușa in Romania. A number of these have been found, and you can see how these, in this case, copper alloy plates overlap. But unlike Lorica segmentata, which overlaps from the top of the body down to the bottom, these overlap from the bottom up to the top because they're worn on the inside of the arm, and they're designed to direct any weapon like a sword blow towards the elbow. And because of the nature of the thing, when your crook of your elbow when you're holding a sword compresses a number of these plates, so the arm is at the thickest where this meets it. This is Peter Connolly's reconstruction of the Newstead piece. I remember him first showing this to me when he was on his way up to Newstead, up to Melrose. He brought it to my house when I was living on Tyneside. Scared the cat rigid. And here we see again some of these legionaries on the metopes on Trajan's column, on the Adam Clissi monument, and they have got these arm guards on their arms. The point is that when you're fighting with a sword, the legionary protected behind his shield, and he had his sword advanced not very far in a at the ready position, similar to the sort of position that gladiators used. But then when he had to strike, he had to extend his arm, and at that point it became vulnerable, particularly to troops with Dacians with these falchies. So this was an extra measure to provide protection for the soldier's sword arm. Swords, we have again, these are first century examples. On the left hand side we have an infantry gladius. It's always called a gladius, but gladius just means sword in Latin, but it tends to mean the short sword. This is the Pompey form of the gladius. On the right hand side, two examples of the cavalry spada, the longer shield sword. Originally Roman swords, the gladius hispaniensis, was used by both cavalry and infantry because it was longer than the later infantry sword. And as the infantry sword got shorter, this gave the cavalrymen a disadvantage, so they needed longer swords. So this led to the development of the spada, which wasn't actually called that until the 2nd century AD. So in the 1st century AD, both of these types of sword would be called a gladius, just to confuse everybody. Some fittings from swords, you can see a bone pommel at the top left, a bone handguard at the bottom left, copper alloy scabbard ring attachment. On the right hand side you can see the suspension rings on a reconstructed Pompey type gladius sheath. This is actually a replica of one that was found at the site of Pompeii, reconstructed by the Urban Street Guard. And you can see how these rings function, and this is part of a scabbard. Here's a sword that has been often in interpretations ritually killed. I'm always very wary of these interpretations, largely because we know Roman swordsmiths were not always at their best, and broken swords and bent swords do come to light. So we can't always be placing a ritual interpretation on these things. Later, in the 2nd century AD, the Romans move away from using the Gladius for infantry, and they also start equipping them with the spada, the longer sword, and they move the suspension side from the right hip to the left hip, and everybody has the same swords. And you can see 3 examples of shapes from spadae of the 2nd century. On the left-hand side, these typical peltiform designs, which you don't find on swords in the 1st century. And on the right is a complete example that again was found at Demien, where you can see the sword with all the fittings and the remains of the wooden scabbard and the handle still present. And there's my reconstruction of one that was found in a warrior burial at Lyon in France, which is possibly belonging to a soldier fighting for Septimius Severus during the battle in 197. Another rather interesting find, it doesn't look like much, but it is symptomatic of a problem that dogs the Romans after this change to the longer sword. And that is the fact that the spada was vulnerable to breakage in use. And this is a cut down spada. You can see the tang survives intact, and the first bit of the blade, which has then been reshaped to try and make some sort of dagger out of the thing. And we have large numbers of these semi-spadae, as they're often called, which are referred to by Vegetius, but which turn up amongst the archaeological record, as you can see on the right-hand side, where a long sword has been cut down and repurposed by being shaped. Other weapons that are present, we've got arrows typical of archers, trilobate tanged arrowheads, ballista bolts shot from catapults, usually thought to be legionary weapons. Some have argued for auxiliary use, but usually they're a sign of legionary presence. And of course, the famous delabri from Newstead, which are used for engineering work, which of course was always thought to be a legionary preserve. You can see that in the top right, but also used in combat. You can see it in the bottom right from Trajan's column. We know that the auxiliaries did do engineering work. It wasn't just the legionaries. The vallum running behind Hadrian's Wall appears to have been built by auxiliaries rather than legionaries, but it's one of those little details that the Trajan's column legionary versus auxiliary battle leads to. 2 more engineering tools. We have a LIGO, an entrenching tool on the left, almost identical to the First World War pattern entrenching tool. And on the right, what's usually interpreted as a turf cutter, for cutting turf to make walls and defences. All troops needed tents. Tent leather survives from Newstead, and on the right-hand side, some hand-cut wooden tent pegs. I bought that one on the left-hand side at WOMAD a few years ago. You can still make them. There are videos on YouTube showing you people making these things in about 1 minute. It's incredibly easy to do, to shape them. And they are the way of keeping a tent up. You can see the replica of a Roman tent on the right, based on the find that came from Vindolanda, as well as tent leather from Newstead. We can't say much about the shields, apart from the fact there are a couple of bosses that survive. These could come from either legionary or auxiliary. There's nothing to give us any clue. A quick run through unit identity. We know, as I've said, about there being cavalry as well as legionaries. The boar, of course, being the sign of the 20th Legion. One little detail that intrigues me is this piece of metal on the left from Newstead, which has a very close comparative piece from the Corbridge Hoard. And we know that there was links between Corbridge and Newstead in terms of pottery, and certainly the material that you've got here hints at some sort of connection. Because of this aspect of the ownership of equipment, troops were inclined to write their names on things to show their ownership. You can see some scratched names on the back of these saddle horn covers. Likewise, on these backing plates for a series of decorative or award phalleri. Here's the set from Lauer's Fort in Germany, showing you what the front part would have looked like. Unfortunately, only the backs survive from Newstead. Again, all with the name Domitius Atticus scratched on them in a sort of passive-aggressive way. Please don't nick my medals. Some of the spears from Newstead, and one on the right shows you T-I-U-N-B-A, which has been interpreted as Turma Unius Bassius, or Unibassi, the Turma of Unius belonging to Bassus. So he's put his name on his javelin head. The dimensions of these spearheads actually matches the javelin heads from Damian. There's also some hints of provincial identity. These boss and petal design pieces of equipment are relate to what's often called the Celtic Renaissance in northern Britain. And these types of fittings are unique to Britain. You don't find them in other provinces. So they hint at some sort of provincial identity amongst the troops and those associated with them. Two on the left are definitely cavalry fittings. The ones on the right, possibly, but more likely a dress fitting. On the left here, you can see a standard Roman style terret from wagon harness. And on the right hand side is a more native style of terret. And here's more native material. Sword on the left has a handguard of a native type, but it's not a pure native type, it's a Roman influenced native type, and those have been found from a number of Roman sites across Britain from the 1st century AD. And you can see more of these boss and petal designs from various bits of equipment. So in summary, the military equipment can tell us quite a lot about the troops at Newstead. You can get some idea of the date from it, as you've seen. We can distinguish the troop types in a number of examples, as I've shown you. And then there are some that you can't, like shield bosses, you can't possibly tell who those belong to. But some of it is quite characteristic. Sometimes you can determine particular units. Nothing from Newstead gives that game away, unfortunately, but some military equipment can do this, particularly if it's inscribed with the unit name. And it acted as an expression of the individual identity of the wearer. And if you need to know what sort of motivates people to do this, you really need to watch some of the cycling channels on YouTube, where people are obsessed with the way they look and what they have and the equipment and what they wear, to exactly the same sort of extent that I expect Roman cavalrymen and legionaries as well. And they also, as I hinted at the end, can act as an expression of regional identity, because there's equipment in this country that you don't find in other countries, and equipment in other countries that you don't find in this country, despite the fact that we do have a degree of movement amongst the troops across the empire. So there you are. Thank you very much for listening to me waffle on about Roman military equipment.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much. I think it would only be fair if everybody would like to unmute themselves, because it's one of the only few drawbacks of Zoom. We can't hear people. So if you could unmute yourselves, and I'll show your appreciation to Mike's chat tonight. So a round of applause, maybe from the unmuted Zoom front rooms of the area. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Do you want to unshare your screen quickly? That would be great. That's great. Thanks so much. Really interesting talk tonight, Mike. Max messaged while you were chatting, and he agreed wholeheartedly about the chainmail and your attempts to make it. And he said he's had to try to repair some at events. So he was agreeing with you wholeheartedly with the time and the attention and the bother to actually create that stuff.
And the dirt, it makes your hands dirty as well.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, so thanks, Max, for chipping that one in. And I particularly liked, I mean, I like the whole talk, but particularly the analogy between the cavalry being the air force, and the training parades, and the parades being like the Red Arrows. I think that link through to the modern rings with a lot of stories. We've been talking to visitors to Trimontium recently about the deposition of the finds that Trimontium left at Trimontium, comparable to the goodies left behind in Afghanistan after only 20 years of occupation, and the fact that there was no way all that stuff was coming home, and the same with some of this stuff not coming home 2,000 years earlier from Trimontium. So thanks for painting those pictures for us tonight, Mike. Brilliant. I see John's there, and hopefully I think John might have a question to get you started, and I'll have a little look in the chat at some questions that have come in after John's posed one.
Mike, thank you. That was a fabulous talk as always, and I'm sorry it's taken so long for you to be able to come back again, because I remember your original talk was cancelled right at the start of COVID, and it's taken this long to get you back on schedule, and it's a great shame that you weren't able to join us in person for one of our meals and Bert's, but hopefully you'll keep that in the bank. Can I ask two techie questions? One is, what is the tensile strength, or what's the relative tensile strength of these bronze cavalry fittings? Because they look quite fragile, the hidden junctions. And you can imagine these things pinging off with all the stresses of a big horse and a rider in battle. So is there any, do you have a feel for where these routinely break?
Yes, you do find examples that break, but I think the secret was that the force is distributed across the whole horse because of the way that the harness is set up. You certainly find, looking at them, evidence of wear on the rings. Invariably, if you look at them, you can find that there is wear, and it's true also of all the fittings, the functional fittings. Obviously, the decorative bits don't do anything; they don't suffer. But the junction loops, the phalleri, they all suffer with use. And you do find one or two examples of the things being of rings breaking. There's one or two examples I've seen that were actually repaired by brazing, but that's not common. They were made by casting. Those examples, we have some molds that were found at Elysia in France, actually, dating to the Claudian period, and they were made by the lost wax method. So the mold had to be destroyed for each piece, and this is a tremendous undertaking when you think how many of these things you've got to make 5 phalleri for every horse, and you've then got to make a whole series of other fittings. All of them are unique castings which then have to be remade. One of the great advances of the 2nd century AD was the development of the implementation, because it had been around some time, of the 2-part mold, so that you could effectively copy an existing fitting and then cast it and then reuse the mold that you've used a number of times, which made things much more efficient. And it meant you could effectively photocopy other people's equipment using this system. But all those early ones had to be individual castings, and we do find failed castings occasionally where they didn't work. You also occasionally find trial castings where they've been cast in lead to try out 2-part molds in particular. There's no point doing a trial casting of a 1-part lost wax piece. But so most of the pieces that are lost, they don't show signs of broken rings at the back. So those are not a vulnerable part of the harness. The straps fittings are much more vulnerable where they join onto. I think they go first rather than the phalleri.
Thank you. And the second question was, you started with the Trajan's column. What are these crazy loops on the helmets of the troops on Trajan's column? Because I haven't seen those in the archaeological record at
There
all.
are one or two examples of these rings. It used to be there was only one helmet with a ring, which was a silver helmet in Toledo, in the museum there, which was a fake. And so everyone said, oh, rings on the top, that's a fake. But then examples with rings did start occurring. John Colston has a wonderful slide he always shows when discussing these of a scene of the Clone Wars of Star Wars, where all the androids are deposited from the carriers, hung from their heads and dropped down onto the ground. So he likes to think of Roman legions being deposited in that way. I think he's making it up. It's not a common feature. Normally at the top of the helmet you find a crest knob where a crest would be attached, but there are one or two examples where there are rings, and rings we think may have been used for attaching plumes. The Crosby Garrett helmet, which was found a few years ago, had a series of rings around the back, and we think that may have been for attaching extra plumes to the thing.
Oh, thank you. That's brilliant.
Lovely, thank you, John. Thank you, John. Again, as other evenings, we've had messages from Canada, from the States, and across Europe tonight. So thanks, Mike, for your talk this evening. Very much appreciated. Richard's got a question related to the horses, the cavalry horses. So I wonder if Richard is still with us. If you'd like to unmute your microphone and pose your question.
Yes, hello from Aberdeen. Where did the horses come from? Because they would have to be a fairly sort of standard breed. Were there specialist breeding centres for them?
This is a tricky question. There's some evidence to suggest that the horses were as widely gathered as troops were recruited from around the empire. There were almost certainly horses that were being bred in this country. The horse skeletons that were found, or the horse skulls that were found at Newstead, indicated a variety of types, as the original report in Curl's volume tells us. Most of the horses are from the battlefield site that I mentioned at Crefeld, were around about 14 hands in height. We know only of one possible training centre at the Lunt near Coventry, where there's a circular feature called a gyrus, which is thought to have been used for horse training, particularly horse breaking. But we don't actually have the evidence to tell us in detail where these horses are coming from, but certainly we suspect that they're not just coming from Britain, that there would be a variety of native horses and horses from, particularly from the northwest of Europe, coming in.
Lovely. Thanks for your question, Richard. Much appreciated. And Kenneth, if you're still with us, would you like to turn your microphone on and pose your question?
I'm just wondering, is there any evidence of the chariots being used by the Romans on the frontier?
No, Romans never used chariots in the sense of two-wheeled vehicles drawn by horses into battle. However, there is a rather wonderful document by an anonymous writer called the De Rebus Bellicis, where he sort of came up with a series of clever ideas that would defeat the barbarians towards the end of the Roman period. And one of the ideas he came up with was chariots with scythed wheels pulled by cataphract horses. So that's horses completely armored. Needless to say that, like his ox-powered paddle boat, were just ideas. They never happened. He was one of those people who thought technology provided the solution to everything rather than a practical approach. So they never used chariots in battle. They did come up against chariots, obviously, particularly in Britain, but never used them themselves.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kenny. Thanks, that's great. Thanks, Mike, so much for answering those questions this evening. I'm relatively new to the borders, and it is horse country around here, and I'm always quite pleased to feel that the input of the Romans 2,000 years ago, and the cavalry, the training, the skirmishes, the use of the horses in this area, there's a percentage of that has travelled through the millennia to now, and the fact that we are in horse country. So there must be a correlation somewhere along the line, that we're still in a part of the world where horses are up front and kind of in everybody's kind of perspective. So that's travelled through the time there. Thanks so much for your talk this evening, Mike. Be a pleasure to see you at Trimontium when you're in this part of the world next. Do please pop in, and I think if we could maybe unmute ourselves once more, everybody, and just give Mike a round of applause for his talk this evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.